We have another trusted servant here today, a lady who's worked very hard in AA for a long time. Started out as a GSR, was elected on up the ladder, became delegate from Northwest Texas. Last year, she was elected trustee of the entire Southwest region. And this lady has devoted her life to AA since she's been in the fellowship. And so I'd like to give you Levelle C. from El Paso, Texas.
Thank you, Paul. My grandmother would have a fit if she could see me up here with chewing gum in my mouth. But when I get excited, when I get nervous, my mouth gets dry. And I also have to go to the bathroom. Thank you. I want to thank Paul and the committee for asking me. I don't think that you could have known how much I have needed this meeting. When I saw the flyer, when I saw the program, and saw that this talk this morning was being called spiritual, it frightened me a little, because about the most spiritual thing I think that I'm going to say is that I prayed mightily before I got over here this morning, that I wouldn't disappoint you. But if there's anyone who went home late yesterday or early this morning because they didn't want to hear something that was billed as a spiritual talk, it's okay, because I have not heard any more spiritual expression than I have through this weekend. I thought that 12-step alcothon yesterday was just beautiful. And the way those people were sharing their experience with the steps made me realize more and more how it is that we do experience a spiritual awareness as a result of taking the steps. And there were so many good things said. I'm going to borrow some of the things. You know, I was told one time that the first time we quote somebody like this, and if I quote anyone here, I'll try to say mention their names and say, as Kathy or Nan or somebody was saying yesterday, and repeat the quote. Now, the next time I say it, I probably am going to say, I heard someone say one time. But the third time, I will have made it my own, and then I'm going to say, it's like I always say. And I didn't bring my halo. It developed a short about 3 or 4 years ago, and I haven't found anybody in AA that's been able to fix it. And I discovered that every time I started flapping my wings, people started leaving the room. So I put them in mothballs long ago. My name is Levelle Clifford. I'm an alcoholic. And I'm sober by the grace of God, working through people like all of you, and because the AA program is working in my life one day at a time. I hope I live long enough to express my gratitude. One day at a time. If I make it until next Saturday, July the 26th, I have not taken a drink or a substitute for a drink since July the 26th, 1962. I married a man in AA. Like so many of you, I drank up a couple of marriages getting here. And after I was sober about 6 months, I met John. He'd been sober quite a while. And because he is not very impulsive, and because he thinks things over pretty carefully, this think, I think he originated. We went together for 6 years and then married. When I was sober 14 years, he was sober 28 years. And I had to remind him that just because he was sober twice as long as I was, it, by God, didn't mean he was twice as sober as I was. And he tells people about this. I loved what was said yesterday about the proper time to do things in AA. I believe it was Nan said that when's the right time to take the 4th step? It's easy. After the 3rd step and before the 5th step. Isn't that simple? There are so many good things that we hear in meetings if we are listening. And I've discovered that what I have to say is not terribly important. And you know, there's no one that can put me in my place better than the people in my home group. We have discussion meetings. And very often when I've just really laid one on them, somebody down the table will say, I was thinking while Levelle was talking. And then a little further on, somebody will say, somebody was saying, and then to top it all off, though, somebody will say, I heard John say so-and-so at the meeting, quoting what I had just said. But our home groups are good for our egos. I don't have a dramatic story. I think every one of us have a story that ends in a miracle. Anyone who gets sober and stays sober in AA is a miracle, a living miracle. And when I try to think of the exciting things to tell you, the first thing I can remember is that I fell in a cesspool once in Denver. And about a week before I called AA, I was doing a little social drinking and dancing by myself to the tune of Pearl Bailey singing, I'm going to keep on doing what I'm doing till I can't do what I'm doing no more. And that's pretty much the story of my drinking life. I just kept on doing what I was doing until I couldn't do it anymore. Incidentally, during the course of this dance, I fell and broke my tailbone. One of the members at home said that he thinks that I'm one of the very few people who knows precisely when she hit bottom. I had my first drink at age 15. The Volstead Act, which many of you were not born when it was written, and maybe not born when it was repealed. It was also known as Prohibition. The Volstead Act had been repealed, and in Texas we had the local option on booze. And in Big Spring, Texas, which was about 20 miles from my grandmother's home, where I visited in the summers, they had just voted 3.2 beer in. I was 15 years old, and in a minute I'll tell you how old I am, so don't worry about that. But that night we went to Big Spring from Stanton, Texas, and had some of that 3.2 beer. But there were some things that were significant about that night, and I didn't know it until after I was sober in AA. First of all, I drank more than I intended to. I blacked out. I lied to my grandmother about where I had been and who I had been with, and this was to happen increasingly often in my life. I was with some people that perhaps normally I would not have been associated. The next day I felt guilty, and one or more of those things happened to me every time I drank for the next 30 years. I had my last drink a few days after I was 45. If your computer's broken down, I just turned 63, and it's okay. It's a good place to be. AA has been very, very good to me and for me. I think it's good for me to remember some of the things about myself, and most of these I didn't discover until after I was sober, because I was too crazy for a long time. But it's good for me to know what things about me made me more susceptible to alcoholism. In addition to my physical inability to tolerate booze, I had a built-in emotional and mental climate. I was going to be alcoholic, no matter who I'd married, no matter where I lived, no matter what my job had been, no matter what. I was going to be alcoholic if I took one drink, and I did, of course. I can't say that I got to AA and fought a good fight and stayed sober. I fought all the way here. I didn't want to think about quit drinking, and I didn't consider quitting drinking until the night that I did consider it one time. I was always anxious to try a different way. I thought that some of those people who seemed to know what they were doing, who seemed to be drinking successfully, knew something I didn't know, and I tried to watch them and see what it was. I tried limiting my drinks after the first time I was out drinking. I promised myself that after 4 I'll quit, and I didn't even remember when I had my 4th drink. And I know that a lot of you have had that same experience. This is the reason you know what I'm talking about. I think possibly the fact that I was, for practical purposes, an orphan at age 3 probably added to my susceptibility. I felt different from the other kids at school. I was jealous because I didn't have a home with the 2 parents and the brothers and the sisters and all of this going on. I did a lot of reading, most of it fairy stories. And, of course, the big problem was that I believed a lot of those fairy stories. I did such a lot of fantasizing. Of course, I knew about the tooth fairy. All little boys and girls know about this. But somehow or other, I thought there might be a hair fairy that was going to come some night and change my cotton top to long black curls. And I thought that possibly, and I was a big girl when I was thinking about this, there might be a foot fairy that would come chop off about an inch of my feet, and I would wear sample-size shoes. I resented my two girl cousins. One of them looked like Shirley Temple. She could tap dance and do cartwheels. And the other one looked like Mitzi Gaynor, and she could stand on her head. And the best that old roly-poly could do was to turn somersaults. And I hated them both. And I have visions of this. You know, the girls were showing off, and I was someplace out here turning somersaults. Look at me, I can turn somersaults. And nobody was paying any attention to me. I went to Sunday school, one of those unfortunate good Christian backgrounds. Yeah, I used to, on Sundays, do you remember Jesus wants me for a sunbeam? And I can still remember that. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it until whatever stage of my life when some changes took place that do take place in a lot of young people. And I don't know whether it's peer pressure. I don't know whether it's society. I don't know what brings it on. But I know that someplace around the age of 13 or 14 maybe, I lost any sense of values I might have. And from then on, I fell very far short of any ideals that I might have been able to develop. And I know that I wasted a lot of years. But isn't it marvelous that we have a now and a today program working for us that lets me know that it took every one of those years, it took every one of those tears, it took every bit of hurt along the way to bring me to the frame of mind where I'd be willing to do whatever I was going to have to do to get sober in AA. Thank God for that. I'm glad everything happened. I, of course, like many of you, am sorry for the hurts that I caused others, but I needed every pain that occurred to me on the way to AA. I didn't want to be who I was. I didn't want to be the daughter of a railroad engineer. I wanted my grandmother to be the president of the Women's Club, like some other friends of mine were. I would much prefer to have had several doctors in the family. I didn't want to be just plain middle-class, wholesome American. I wanted to be sparkly and sophisticated. I was sure that I was going to marry Prince Charming, and what I didn't know was that he had the Frog Prince complex. He thought that he was going to find a fairy princess, and that when she kissed him, he was going to change back from a frog to a prince, and that didn't happen either. Needless to say, we didn't do much for each other. The years that I spent in a kind of a half-real world before the drinking started, I was going to be a teacher. Then I discarded that. And I thought I might be a nurse. A little further down the road, I thought, no, I'll be an actress. And by the time I was ready to start college, I thought that it would be nice to be the sweetheart of Sigma Chi. And I had visions of myself wearing my Phi Beta Kappa key from a charm bracelet. And a little further down the road, I thought of myself as the role model for Duke Ellington's Sophisticated Lady. And I spent many hours over a drink listening to that song on the radio or on records, weeping great tears over this sophisticated lady. And the thing of it was that in all this nostalgia, none of those things had ever happened to me. And I guess it's like so many of us, I was weeping for the things that were not going to happen, that never did happen. And I suppose that it was this kind of regret and sorrow that really got to me. My aunt sent me to a woman's college, and I had started looking like a girl someplace along the way, and she was afraid that I was getting too interested in one of the fellows I was dating. So she sent me to a woman's college. But, of course, this was when I showed her, because the next summer I turned 18, and that's when I married this Prince Charming I told you about. We stayed married 27 years, both of us drinking. And if you all think it's trouble living with one drinking person, any of you that have lived in a home where both of you are drunks know what I'm talking about. Because you both have some of the worst characteristics of the Al-Anon, and certainly all the worst characteristics of the alcoholic. Neither one willing to try to help the other, because I know now that if I had been willing to try to help him, it meant that I was going to have to look at my own drinking, and I couldn't do that. And I know that this is the reason that he couldn't try to ever help me. he was very willing and very ready to bring booze home when I couldn't lift my head off the pillow, because he knew that as long as I was in this condition, I was no threat to his drinking. And we spent this 27 years of this. Had 2 children who certainly were emotionally affected by it. And I'll tell you a little more about them in a minute. But this husband finally left. Now, he had liked girls all along, and somehow or other I couldn't do anything about that. But one old gal came along that he liked better than the rest, and he left me for her. And I don't blame him for my drinking, of course. But I do have to say this. I drank for 4 months after we were divorced and came to AA. That means something to me. I think I was not going to try to get sober as long as I was living in this climate of hatred and resentment that I had. I was not going to try to get sober. And I think God knew this. So I think God sent Betsy and took him away. And I was free then to drink as much as I had to in those 4 months and get sober and stay sober. This has been marvelous. I worked most of our married life, and I worked at some sort of nothing jobs because I had not gone on to college. And I also was faced with the necessity of working in jobs where it wasn't really very important whether I showed up on Monday or not. I did lose one job, and I'll always remember the personnel director calling me in with an IBM card that he was slapping on the back side of his desk. And he said, "Mrs. Bowden, I'd like to keep you. You can work circles around some of those fellows back in the accounting department." But he said, and he slapped this card, he said, "Do you realize that you have been absent 22 Mondays in 11 months?" Well, of course I realized it. I'd had to think up the excuses every one of those damn Mondays. Of course I knew it. And I think it was remarkable that at that time I didn't promise him anything. I didn't tell him that I would try to do better. I think I was already feeling hopeless about my drinking. I just let him fire me and went home and stayed drunk a while. Went out and got another job where it didn't make so much difference whether I showed up on Monday or not. So I used to tell my creditors that I worked to pay bills. But I know better than that now. I worked so I could drink. I paid a few bills when somebody caught up with me, and I just couldn't get out of it. But this ex-husband of mine fussed with me and pushed me around a little bit when I drank his booze. So I worked so that I could buy my own. And this is really just about what it amounted to. And I wound up my drinking career on gin. Started out with scotch and martinis, and I wound up with gin. I remember the Friday that he left, I had told him to take anything out of the house that he needed for housekeeping, because I was not planning to do much in the way of domestic endeavor. I was going to do some social drinking. But I got home from work that afternoon and found that he had taken some etched, monogrammed, double old-fashioned highball glasses that we had. Now, I had never had a double old-fashioned highball. I hadn't had a drink out of a glass for 2 years. But somehow or other, those etched double old-fashioned highball glasses were symbolic of something that I was going to do. Now I was going to be a sophisticated lady. I was going to drink like a lady. And that son of a gun took them. The children that we had were nice, small children. And they were affected by our drinking in the same way that most nice young children are affected. Now, I can't say that we never appeared in juvenile court as a result of one of them. We appeared just about every place there was to appear. And sometimes both of us drunk. One of the boys was in an accident one night, and after we got the emergency care for him, had him in surgery with a doctor sewing his head back together, we turned to each other in the family room and said, "Where can we get a bottle?" And I want you to know that at 2:30 in the morning, we found a bottle. And we drank it between 2:30 and 6. I'm not proud of that. A few days later, when we went up to visit this boy and had had a few drinks on the way, some of his friends were in the room, and after they left, he said, "Mom, I wish you wouldn't come up here drinking." So I had to go off and cry. And I don't know really what I was crying for, except that it was just all so ugly. It was so ugly. This boy, I might say now, is what we would term successful. He and I are not very close. We're friendly enough. He calls me at the right times. He calls me on Mother's Day and my birthday and Christmas and Thanksgiving and New Year's, and I go visit about once a year. And as I say, he's successful in the things that are important to him. But somehow or other, when I'm through talking with him, I have the feeling that I've just been interviewed by a personnel director who doesn't intend to hire me. It may have something to do with the fact that my membership in AA, my sobriety, may be a threat to him. The last time I saw him, he spent a considerable length of time explaining to me how his drinking is not pointing to alcoholism ahead. And he said some of the things that I said about 25 years ago. Now, the other boy just really got to be a stumble-bum drunk. We understood each other. And he just stayed out of the way. He just finished 20 years in the Navy. And I think he would tell you, as many of you who've been in the service would say, that it's probably one of the few places that you could complete your career and get out with a retirement and not much rank, but not have been kicked out for drinking. He was in 3 of their rehab centers before he finally heard enough to get sober. And he's been sober in AA now 2.5 years. And I'm very grateful. I guess I loved those kids as much as I was capable of loving them, as much as any practicing alcoholic is capable of loving. I know that it was not until I got to AA and came to know you all that I was able to love anyone. It was not until I was here that I was able to put myself aside and be able to love unselfishly. One time when this boy was in the big middle of a drunk, he asked me if I thought that alcoholism was inherited. But I understand that some of the smart boys now are saying that it's possibly some genetic factor that is involved in the alcoholic that could be hereditary. I don't know. But I was inclined to think that this kid was like a healthy plant that is set in unhealthy, in sick soil, because he was around both of us, drunks, all of his life, all of his formative years. And when you're around 2 people, when you're a small child needing love and understanding and warmth, and you've got the 2 people you're supposed to be able to lean on, who are so wrapped up in their own problems and in themselves, they cannot possibly love or show love as it should be. And I think that this has something to do with the children of alcoholics being emotionally ready to demonstrate the alcoholism. I think perhaps they do suffer from this lack of love. And I don't claim to be a scientific or a very smart person. Well, there were many things that I discovered, and most of them were based on the things that you taught me. As I told you, I was so concerned with finding someone who would make me happy that it didn't ever occur to me that I had any responsibility toward making anyone else happy. It didn't occur to me that I had any responsibility for my own happiness. I just thought I was supposed to sit back, and somewhere or other the world was going to make me happy. And this, of course, is alcoholic thinking. I've heard a lot of the younger people, and how is it they say it, that they drank and did drugs. Well, I didn't do drugs. They were simply not around very much when I might have been. But I'm realistic enough, and I know myself well enough to know that if they had been, I would have done drugs. I would have been right in there with the best of you, trying. I did realize one time when I was thinking over some things about the whys, and we do try to answer some questions of ourselves. During a period of my life, I had to have surgery, diagnostic surgery, about every 6 months. And I found that each time that my doctor announced to me that it was time to go back in, I was looking forward. I was looking forward to the shot they gave me before we went to surgery. I was looking forward to the blackout and the complete being wiped out under an anesthetic. I was looking forward to the shots that they gave me afterwards if there was pain involved. And you think that I wouldn't have been into drugs had they been around? Of course I would. I know it. And it just happened that I was not in the right place at the right time with the right things available. So I do understand it. I think as far as the A is concerned, I think that any problem we have with this will be settled, and I think that the people who will find the answers will be the young people who have been affected with the dual addiction. I think that they will find the answers, and I don't think we need to get all that excited about it. After I got to AA, started getting sober. Now, I can't say that I came in and took these 12 beautiful steps and my life turned around and everything was just wonderful after that, because I had a heck of a lot of trouble after I got here. Life was just one trauma after another for the first 2 or 3 years. I suppose that with many of us, we start things rolling during the drinking years. We start a lot of things on course, and no matter whether we get sober or not, no matter what we're doing, some of these things are going to go on and go through to their natural conclusion. And if they're troublesome, that's tough. You just have to learn to accept that some of these things are the result of what was happening before sobriety. I had to know this. I came in head over heels in debt. Now, I was still drinking when I got my divorce, but I sat up at the judge and told him that I would pay all of our community debts. Now, in Texas, I didn't have to do that. I was a big shot. So I told the judge that I would pay bills. And I don't know to this day what I thought I was going to pay them with. It took me 7 years to get out of debt. And I wouldn't have gotten out of debt then if I hadn't inherited a little bit of money and been able to clean the rest of it up. I know that now in sobriety. But I suppose that I was like a lot of us drinking. I knew what was right, and I knew I wasn't doing it. And I think that the pain that I was experiencing from falling so far short of my ideals is part of what finally got me here. And I think that almost any alcoholic who comes to AA comes because he is finally hurting from whatever it is that he's doing to himself and others. A lot of us, I suppose, get pushed in or pulled in or talked into it some way or another, some motivation that from some outside sources. But I think that most of us, when we finally come in to stay sober, come in because we have felt pain. And I know that now, and I feel that I have worked the 12 steps to the best of my ability. There'll be many times that I'm in pain. And most of the time when I take a look at myself, bring my inventory up to date, I know that it's because I am failing to do something that I should do, or I am doing something that I should not do. I have to put these things through the steps. I have to acknowledge the unmanageability of my life on a daily basis. And I have to acknowledge the things that occur that I need to change on a daily basis. And having done this, it is easy to put these things through the steps too. Because if God could relieve me of the worst problem I ever had, I know that he can relieve me of character defects that come along now as my life goes on. I know that whatever I'm doing that is insane, he can relieve me, just as he did with the booze. All I have to do is acknowledge this, admit that I am powerless over whatever it is that's got me back to the wall. And usually by the time I've identified it, and then do a fifth step on it, talk it over with someone, a friend or the sponsor, and then ask God to relieve me, it can be done. I had a very dramatic thing happen to me, or to me it was because it was very painful. Several years ago, this ex-husband of mine, who has not quit drinking, by the way, called one day, drunk, and he didn't really say anything unkind. He didn't say anything that was hateful. But I was so disturbed when I got through talking to him that I was sick. I was physically ill and mentally ill for a moment. And as I hung up the phone, I said, God, please let anything happen that has to happen to relieve me of this feeling. I can't live with it. And a few days later, in a meeting, we were discussing the fourth step. And I talked a little bit about alcoholic behavior, saying that when I quit drinking, there were certain things that I had been doing that I simply quit doing because I didn't have to do them when I got sober. There were certain things that were happening in my life that just quit happening because a sober person doesn't experience this. And some of this that is alcoholic behavior, I knew that I had to make amends when people were hurt. I knew that I had to take care of the things that I was responsible for. But I knew the difference between character defects and alcoholic behavior. And as I talked, I realized that this man that I was feeling this surge of hatred for was still drinking alcoholically. And if I expected to forgive myself, and if I expected God to forgive me, and expected the people that I had harmed to forgive me because I had been behaving alcoholically, this man had the same right to that behavior as I did. And as long as he was sick with alcoholism, he was going to be behaving that way. And I was able to let it go, because I know that if for any reason he ever does find AA, that he will be able to do something about these things that cause him to be like that. In the meantime, I had to let it go, and it has been the most beautiful relief I think that I ever had. I was able to face him for the first time when the older boy retired from the Navy not long ago. His father came to El Paso to be a part of the ceremony, and I was able to be in the same room for an hour or so without feeling any bad feelings, and this was good for me. This was very good for me. We talked a little bit, and Paul mentioned service. I don't like to bear down too much on it in this kind of talk, but I did learn early in the game that it was no good for me to sit off in a room at the club and meow with some of the other people, why don't they, not knowing exactly who they were. And one old fellow that was around brought me the service manual and the 12 concepts for service. And when I got through reading those things, I discovered that we were they, that I was they, that if anything was going to be done, that I had as much responsibility as anybody else in AA, and as much opportunity. And when I discovered this, then I wanted to do it all. I was elected GSR, or volunteered as GSR for my group. Then I was serving on the intergroup committee and secretary for an annual convention that we had. I was serving on the board of directors at the club, all at the same time. Well, these things needed to be done, you see, and nobody else was volunteering. And one day one old boy said to me, who do you think you are? Mrs. AA in El Paso? Well, this hurt my feelings, and I cried. And I realized that I was volunteering, I was trying to do too much, that I could probably do one job well and leave the rest to the other people, and if they didn't get done that day, they would eventually. So I got out of a lot of things, and it was okay. I do feel that something I think in AA comes of age, where Bill said that service is anything legitimate that we do that helps preserve the message for or carry the message to the alcoholic. And this can be such a lot of things. It can be so many things more than making a 12-step call when somebody calls you to come talk to a sick drunk. It can mean serving your group as secretary. It can mean making coffee. It can mean picking up the ashtray. It can mean ordering literature so that you've got things on the racks for the new people to come in. It can be being willing to serve on public information committees, going out and talking at schools or with civic groups, people who don't know about Alcoholics Anonymous, being able to tell them of the answer that is here. And by the way, when I have the chance to talk to outside people, I don't hesitate to mention Al-Anon and Alateen as part of a recovery program for the family. But there are many, many things that can be done. There are those who show in their service jobs. They seem to be out front. And I think maybe a lot of this has happened to me. But I discovered, and this fairly recently, that I think that the most important job in AA is to be a member of the group. I'm here this morning and having the pleasant task of talking to you and making this trip to this convention. But you know that at home there are at least 4 AA meetings going on right now. There are people that are doing all the things that are necessary to keep the group going. There were people on the answering service last night to answer the phone when people called in wanting help from AA. The people ready to chair the meeting this morning and to go out and make the 12-step calls. So it takes all of us. It takes all of us. And I think it's a little, as Lydia was saying the other night, that there are so few people who are interested in service. Can you imagine what would happen if a bunch of willful, strong drunks like we are, us who just almost killed ourselves and everybody around us as long as we were determined to drink, can you imagine what it would be like if all of us were determined to be in service? if all of us were determined to be GSR or trustee or whatever, that would be a hell of a situation. It took time for me to begin to get well. One of the young men at a meeting in our home group not long ago made this statement, and I love it. He was telling another new person, things don't change, but you will. And this is so true, because the world has kept on turning, and life keeps on being life. Sometimes people keep on being what they are. But with the program, we learn to live with ourselves and with other people, with people and places and things as they are. And this has been just marvelous. Not to have to drink, not to have to get sick over it, because it's just as bad to go ahead and be sick over trouble as it is to drink. In my home group, which is meets in a little church, this church has a dial-a-prayer service, and they have a mechanism, a machine in the kitchen that we can hear click when someone calls in on that dial-a-prayer. And we know when we hear this click that there's somebody out there in the world who is unhappy and sick and alone. And the only thing he has is that dial-a-prayer service, a mechanical device and a tape to help him through a lonely moment. And I look around the table at the people that I share my program with in my group, and I think how lucky we are, because if I'm in pain, I have friends that I can pick up the phone and call. I can bring things up at the meetings and get some answers, get some things to help me work things through. And these poor devils out there who don't have it. So I know how lucky I am and how lucky you are. I've learned a little more about living in the now, and I've learned that since I started this service as trustee. I have learned that to enjoy where I am right this moment. And this has been a beautiful weekend. Now, I wasn't going to be able to be at home celebrating somebody else's birthday or celebrating my own. I wasn't going to be able to be doing some things 1,000 miles from here. But how much I've been able to do and how much I've been able to learn, and the things that I've heard here that will help me in the future by being here now. One of our friends who conducts some retreats that we go to from time to time uses this statement, wherever you are, be there. And I think that this is so true. It's the other side of that coin that, no matter where you go, you take yourself with you. I like that idea, and I am learning. I am learning to really enjoy the now. Every minute I have learned a little bit more about preparation, and that's okay. Last year there was something like 60,000 AA miles that I traveled, and this is a lot of moving around for a 63-year-old woman. But I've enjoyed every bit of it. I don't think that I'll ever be able to express my gratitude. This older son of mine, who has been sober 2.5 years, came home last February when we were planning the annual convention that we have in El Paso. Now, he had been sober 3 months when he discovered that his wife had terminal cancer. I was very apprehensive because he had not stayed sober in his other attempts when he'd come to AA. And I was very apprehensive. I thought that his sobriety was so fragile, I didn't see I could possibly live through it. But I went to Hawaii where he was stationed, and I went to meetings with him, and I met a lot of his friends there. And when I got on the plane to come home, I realized that these people I met in AA there were just like the people that I meet here all the time in AA. And the program there, the same program that we're working all over the world. And I knew that I could leave it where it was there, that I could let it go, because I knew that if he wanted it, he was going to have it available. And when he came home, a little over 2 years later, he's still sober. We were having this meeting, and I had promised myself that I was not going to be a hovering, mothering, mother and son act. And I knew that it was going to take a little discipline on my part. So I was trying to stay away from the kid. Well, every time I turned around, if I sat down to listen to a speaker, he was right by me, pulling on my sleeve. Hey, did you hear what he said? Did you hear? So this was okay. And when the meeting was over and we stood and repeated the Lord's Prayer, this was a beautiful thing for me to have happen, because I didn't teach that kid the Lord's Prayer. You did. Thank you for giving me a chance to say thank you.